Like all the great stories, this one started with a fish pie. Or rather, it was that I didn't really know how to start with a fish pie. The problem wasn't the fish, it was the stuff in the middle. How do you do the stuff in the middle? The creamy, gooey, smells like the sea stuff. But if the sea was cheese, you know? That stuff. Every time I've tried it, I've ended up with a sort of steaming, translucent mess. So I needed someone to show me what to do. Bummed out about not knowing what I was doing, I cranked up YouTube and I searched fish pie recipes. And there was one that for some reason I was drawn to. One by this guy, Marco Pierre White. At that point, I had no idea about him. A chef, clearly, but I'd only ever seen his face, like leering out from a restaurant frontage near where I worked. That was all I knew. He sounds French and important, I thought, so I clicked. The video was very short, just like 4 minutes, but as I watched, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, and it was nothing to do with the pie. It was something about this guy, Marco, the way he was explaining what to do. This imperious man was being very concise, clear, above all, certain about what he was doing. Very quick, very simple, he said. No real recipe, he said, even though it seemed apparent to me that there definitely was. It was my choice, he said, even though it seemed otherwise. But these odd commandments aside, it was how his instructions were delivered with an almost life or death seriousness that really struck me like something deep. 4 minutes later, the video was concluded. The result? A fish pie that looked like pure heaven. Now, you might expect me to say, I tried it, it worked, my life was changed for the better. But no, to be honest, I was so shell-shocked by what I'd just seen that I didn't even bother trying to make a fish pie of my own. Not right away. Instead, I went and found every YouTube video of this guy making food that I could find, from anywhere, from any time. And over time, it felt like I was watching the arc of a great person's life work. Because what hit me was that what I'd found wasn't just some dude's recipe video that worked. It was more than that, much more. I think I had found my new sensei.
You look at the pictures, the black and white pictures of Marco, and he's a rock star, isn't he? Absolute rock star.
He looks like he's just done a 2-hour set in a sweaty basement singing. He looks exhausted.
He's physically looming as well, you know.
Yeah, it's arrogant, but there's something about the twinkle in his eye that's acceptable when he does it.
I think I was kind of in awe of him, to be quite honest.
This guy's attitude is legendary. So too is his talent. But what I think is most interesting about him is that Marco Pierre White seems to be one of the most defiant characters I can think of. And that's why he is the first in this new series. A series that's going to get into the lives of the most impressive, pugnacious, difficult and provocative geniuses of our times. People who did it their way. From Big City Nights, it's the show dedicated to the people who store down their critics and basically said, you know what? Eat me. My name is Ciaran Tracey and this is Season 1 on Marco Pierre White. Episode 1, Work It. The first times you clock him, everything about MPW seems terse, formal, a bit angry. Big time chef, doesn't suffer fools. To me though, when you watch him, when you really dive into the hundreds of short cookery instruction videos he's done, you get past that caricature. And my reason for wanting to talk about him is that I think if you really listen, if you really dig in, he's got some wisdom that goes way beyond food. This series is my search for that wisdom. So from each of the eras in his career, there's something I think you can take. And part of all of this is the joy I've gotten from going back through a load of those 80s, 90s and 2000s cookery videos. Because in a way, to me, they're like a gateway to another world. But it's not just me. Through this, I'm going to be having some pals here to revel in them as well. Starting with that fish pie video.
This was one of the first things that I saw of Marco as well. I'd known about his reputation, but not necessarily watched the man. So I always just saw him as like Gary Rhodes or, you know, Ainsley Harriott, just a TV chef. And I saw him almost like parenting us through the creation of this dish. So he was very...
This is journalist Kirsty Bosley. I love her writing about food, so I asked her what she thought about this imperious communication style.
it was like, you know, that harsh teacher that you've got at school that you hated at the time, but afterwards you think, yeah, they got the message through to me that I needed, and I remember what they told me. So it was one of those things where I was like, he's blunt and direct, but I felt like I came away from it understanding a little bit more about why he's done the way that he has with this particular dish.
Kirsty's put her finger on what loads of people see in him, the straight-talking, cut-the-crap style.
I just thought of him as someone that just hasn't got time for flowery TV personalityness, and I kind of like that.
Loads of other people as well. Just check out the comments under any of his videos. People go nuts for it. But in that fish pie video, Marco talks very sternly about building layers of taste, setting it all out method by method, which led me to thinking, if I'm going to understand this guy, I've got to go right back to the basics, back to the start, because much, if not all of his character is formed by his origin story. And you know something, if you're like me and all you know is this big glowering long-haired guy getting cross over carrots, that origin story might surprise you. So let's start at the start. First off, Marco Pierre White. Sounds French, right? And posh too? Well, turns out, nope to both. In fact, he's from a council estate in Leeds in the north of England. His dad was British, but his mum was Italian, so that's where the name's from. Anyway, he's a young boy in the 1960s going from this grim Leeds council estate to summers in Italy where he sees his relatives and eats fresh pasta and fruit off the trees, something you sure as hell aren't doing in Leeds. But it's at this point in his early life, when he's just a boy of 6, that a tragedy will define more or less everything for him from here on in. That is the death of his mum. Now, you can imagine the effect this would have. I mean, he may be this big towering guy now, but he's told in the past of how after this he would wet the bed for years, how he'd be laughed at for answering questions in Italian because he was so messed up in his head that he didn't know what was going on in class. And one other small thing here, he's just Marco White. The idea of him being Pierre or anything on a Leeds council estate in the 60s, that ain't going to happen. By his teens, he's got to go out and find work, which he does as a kitchen hand in a big hotel in a nearby town. This is the 1970s, and the other cooks in this hotel are most definitely from the 1970s. So Marco, is treated like any teenager at the bottom of the kitchen would be, which means basically he's bollocked over and over and over again. But the thing about Marco here is that he soaks up these bollockings like a sponge. He was a hard-bitten kid to begin with, and this only hardens him more. Because as he says, what could be worse than his mum dying? Nothing. So he's able to take this in a way that others couldn't. At the same point, he's just kind of getting the food bug because this hotel served proper food and very well too. But as much as that, he sees this hotel has standards, speed, organisation, presentation. He's taking it all in. And one day, at the hotel on a break from getting bollocked, he's flicking through this little restaurant guide that was lying around on a table. It's by this guy with a memorable name. You might have seen it on the doors of places. A guy called Egon Ronay, whose food guide was basically the Bible when it came to where to eat in Britain. Ask your folks about it sometime. And as Marco's flicking through these little pages, he notices that this guy Egon Ronay, he picks out a special little place near Leeds, close to where Marco's from. Egon says that this place is one of the best in Britain, a hidden gem of gastronomy. The best food in Britain? Near Leeds, where he's from? What's all that about? So Marco asks around the chefs in the hotel that he's working in, and they all speak of it in hushed tones. This restaurant is called the Box Tree, and it is truly special, they say. And so this is where young Marco takes his first quantum leap. He simply thinks, well, why am I here then? That's where I need to be. Something's clicked. I guess since you're listening to this, you probably already know all about Michelin. I mean, where I'm from, they're called Michelin and you put them on a Honda 250, but everywhere else, they're the tire people who somehow wound up giving restaurants stars of greatness. And the Box Tree, this place that Marco had read about, well, it had 2 Michelin stars. And this is where journalist Kirsty Bosley comes back. See, the reason I called Kirsty up about doing this thing was because of an article she wrote, and the idea was simple. She just wanted to go to a Michelin star restaurant to see what it was like.
I was like, I want to go and see what this is, because if I'm going to write about food, I need to have a handle on what that looks like. I've done all of the Harvesters and the Toby Carveries, but what does that other side look like? And so I said, can I go along as just like a common as muck girl and see if I can catch the hype.
Her article was titled, "I'm common as muck and I spent £150 in a Michelin restaurant just to see if it was worth it." Look it up. It's a hoot.
The way you communicated what it felt, number one, to be treated in a Michelin star restaurant. Number two, what you ate. Can you remember, what do you remember?
Everything, mostly. Just because it was so significant. I grew up in a household where food wasn't always guaranteed for every meal, apart from school where we got free school meals, and just had the same thing every single day. And so the experience of having food that tells the story of someone's entire culinary history, everything they've ever eaten, everything they've ever been told by someone, every book they've ever read. And I'm getting not only flavours that I've never had before, but they're designed in such a way to go with one another that it creates this symphonic experience. And I was high off it.
Michelin. This is what the best food does. And back then, Marco was common as muck too. But he also wanted to get a taste of it. He's very lucky. There's a job going at the box tree. And when he first turns up, he says it was like walking into an Aladdin's cave. He says it was run by these two eccentric, camp, brilliant proprietors, and they saw something in him. They take him under their wing, and once he's in the door, they and their head chef begin to regale him with tales of the grand French restaurants which they visit each year to bring the ideas back home to this restaurant in Britain. And he's just listening to these gentlemen go on these flights of culinary imagination, and it changes his whole world. With every julienne he's slicing, with every shallot he's dicing, he's dreaming of what he can begin to achieve with his food. But there's a problem. His whole world was still just the outskirts of Leeds, and he knows he has to get out. Not least because his relationship with his dad is breaking down. Food and the work of food is all he's got. If you want an insight into what made Marco what he is now, where that character comes from, much of it emerges from what happens next. He's basically about to make himself invincible, training under not just one great chef, but four of the absolute major domos of high-end cuisine that existed in Britain through the 1980s. How? Well, basically by banging doors, actually banging doors. For the next 6 years, that's what he's going to do over and over to the best of the best, telling them, I want to work with you. So who were these major domos? Let's go meet them. It all starts with the most respected of them all, when after a missed train and a chance lift from a postman, Marco finds himself wandering the streets of London in the wee hours of the morning, and somehow he ends up passing the window of one of London's most storied restaurants, Le Gavroche. It was a place he'd already applied for and messed up their application paper, and yet here he was, randomly, outside its window. So, astonished by his luck, he pads the streets overnight and returns in the morning, knocking the door, and his gumption pays off. He is guided to its legendary master chef, Albert Roux. Once again, like at the box tree, the big guy sees something in this kid's temperament. So Marco goes into another world of grinding apprenticeship. The commanding Albert Roux will bollock Marco, to be sure, but he also teaches him the beginnings of real mastery. Marco's told it often that after he'd won his confidence, Albert ushers him in one day into his office and says, Marco, do not fear the stove. Attack the stove. Too many chefs fear it. You gotta go at it. And well, obviously, he does. And as if this wasn't hard enough, he then does a double shift. This is where we're going to meet the next big cheese of the restaurant scene. Marco's addicted to his work, addicted to the kitchen. He has little else in his life. Plus, he realises he can make a few quid. So as well as those nights in the Gavroche, in the morning he puts in a shift at another restaurant. This one run by another of Britain's most eminent chefs, a guy called Nico. Now, Nico Ladenis, he looks like a Russian mafia heavy, or maybe an opera singer, or maybe both. Bald head, thick black beard that sort of looks like two beards, or possibly three. He's one of the next true greats. He had a temper that's been described as incendiary. He forbade diners to have salt, he'd kick their chair legs if they weren't sitting upright enough. And remember that food guide writer, Egon Ronne? Well, Nico was once quoted as saying he could drop dead. Nice. So this guy Nico, he believed in his own food. And Marco works under him for a while, and what he says he learns from Nico is consistency. back at the main job at Le Gavroche, there's a bit of a fallout when boss Albert Roux jabs a soup ladle in Marco's face. Marco tells him basically to go fuck himself, which is no small thing, but they patch it all up. But Marco knows it's time to move on. So after a while there, he goes knocking again, this time to the only other 3-star restaurant in London at that time, run by a guy called The Bear. And I'm talking the original The Bear here, the actual one, not the TV kind. He is Pierre the Bear Koffmann, a renowned genius chef and ass kicker at his Chelsea restaurant, La Claire. So this young but increasingly able Marco White, still in his early 20s, swallows hard to knock at that door. Pierre the Bear sees this young guy's drive and ambition and immediately says, no, won't have him, no spaces, can't take you in. But get this, you want to know how much Marco needed to work under him? Despite having already worked at the Box Tree, Le Gavroche and Nico's under the biggest chef bosses in the game, he says he'll start working for Pierre the Bear for free, which seems ridiculous who he'd already worked for, but that's what he does. Pierre the Bear, of course, readily agrees and then takes him on. Marco is thrilled because he can now get bollockings from Pierre, a man whose own reputation was massive at the time.
He was a very big character, a very tall man, very thick-set man. The silence in the kitchen, and you know, it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was a happy environment in his kitchen. He was a bear, a character again. You wouldn't mess with. Yeah.
Meet Chef Aaron Patterson. He's held a Michelin star for over 3 decades at his restaurant called Hamilton Hall. Aaron too, though, did time in Pierre the Bear's kitchen at Claire, and that discipline remains with him today.
I'm still drumming it into these guys. It's every day. It's every dish, every first course, every dessert is done up and presented to me before we go into service. So it's really important to sort of get that point across.
But not just that. Aaron also worked in the kitchen of the final chef that Marco will go to ask for a job. The end-of-level boss, the colourful, charismatic, intense Raymond Blanc at his restaurant, Le Manoir aux Quatre Saisons, outside Oxford.
Ball of energy, absolute ball of energy. Light on his feet, very inspirational. In service, he'd sort of come in and bounce around the kitchen, which wasn't always fantastic. But he said, well, mon petit, do you want some help? And I'd be serving, I'd be on the fish and I'd be plating 3 fish dishes. I soon realised that the people that said no were the people that he got on into, and he would make their lives difficult, make it very, very difficult. And that's when I've seen that so many times. But what a bloke. I mean, he's the most talented guy I've ever worked with. And, and he's responsible for a great Marco and so many others.
It was Raymond Blanc who taught Marco how to truly express himself with his food. He also taught him how to really understand his palate. And actually, because all of this series is basically about YouTube videos I nerd out on, get this, you can see it in action. Just look up Raymond Marco or whatever on YouTube. In fact, there's this one old video of Le Manoir's kitchen with Raymond twirling around at light speed, orders coming in French, Raymond looking stressed as hell, and a very young Marco plating up.
I heard quite a few great stories about Marco in the kitchen at the time. He was a bit of a loose cannon. I don't think that the relationship between Raymond and Marco was that great, actually. But he was he definitely a loose cannon. But when you're under pressure in service in a kitchen of that standard, or any standard, if certain people sort of get very nervous and uptight when they're under pressure, whereas he was quite sort of flamboyant and he was almost like an artist, where he'd be able to sort of throw things on the plate and it'd still look elegant, if you know what I mean. And so he was a real artist. But you've got to be a strong character to survive in that kitchen, and you've got to be seriously focused and determined to take everything that comes your way and deal with it. And it's not an easy environment.
I guess the takeaway here is that Marco rocking up to these chefs, to these kitchens, was his choice. A phrase that's repeated over and over and over in all his videos these days. The years of 16-hour days, the dressing downs and browbeatings from the most unrelenting chefs. He'd thrown himself at this, in no small degree to escape a disintegrating family situation and a lack of social confidence too. Yet the tuition that earned him would be like some young actor these days getting parts with like Pacino, De Niro, under Scorsese while getting some sort of side part with Pesci. It was an insane run. But no one sought out Marco. No one handpicked him. On the contrary, what leaps out to me about all of this is that he actually picked them. Anyway, he did his time with the balletic Raymond Blanc at the Manoir, but if we're really honest, Marco was always destined to run a kitchen of his own. And in late 1986, the chance will come to him. The place was called Harveys. Two money guys had set it up and they tapped Marco to be its head chef. It was a tiny place on the wrong side of London, but it was his chance and he went for it. Again, this is how I got going on this whole daft tale. It's here where you can see some wonderful old 1980s TV programming that fans have made and that makes sure lives on YouTube. I implore you to go find this stuff. Just search Marco Harveys. Now, Harveys wasn't exactly a decor classic. Think ostentatious plants on top of like Roman plaster style columns with big stucco plaster mirrors and what looks like lemon yellow walls. But these old programmes capture the life of this tiny restaurant.
You can almost smell the place, I felt. It was very 80s, 90s, like ugly living room vibes.
But even at age 27 or so, what you can see in these programmes is the young Marco becoming the full character. At times, it's like Spinal Tap, but mostly what you see is an uncompromising young man running his own show back and front of house.
There's two very distinct parts of Harveys, and at some points he does cross the threshold, so when he's sitting outside, having a fag, answering the phone, pretending that he's French and that he's not Marco, and then sometimes flirting with people on the phone and say, I'll make space for you no matter what.
His manner in these videos is impetuous, full of self-confidence, doing everything with speed and almost total investment, demanding his junior chefs watch and memorise everything he does with instant photographic memory. You see them stand to attention, mimicking his moves, tasting a little sauce from a scorching hot pan with their little finger. It's almost like a karate move. Moving 3 different things onto his plate, carrots, scallops, foie gras, without getting on top of each other. All while he's hunched over the same plate, sniffing distance from the food, seasoning it with just a micron more salt, a soupçon more lemon. I love these videos. There are loads of them, and they're an incredibly powerful picture of an expert at work who won't back down.
When you see the controlled intensity in that kitchen, like it's quite a thing to see. It's like the pressure's just all getting funneled through him and he's like looking down and doing all this. And they're just like, yes chef, no chef. How did that strike you?
Almost as though he was driving this machine where everyone's got these working parts and they're all looking to him like this beating heart of the kitchen to get done what they needed to get done. And you could see that when he was effing and jeffing at people and having a go at them, they were looking disheartened, but you can kind of tell that it's not because of the way that he's spoken to them, but more that they didn't do the thing that he was asking or requiring of them in the first place. And so while I do think that there was intensity there, all of the intensity is driven for the purpose of keeping this whole body moving, which I just thought was really fascinating, because it's almost like a building site where it's like, where are those bricks? I need this cement, like, or any output. You have to have all of these parts like moving at the same time, because everyone gets let down if you don't. It's harsh, but it's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, just ask Gordon Ramsay. One of the most famous Marco memes you'll see is of him explaining that he didn't make Gordon cry. Gordon Ramsay made himself cry. It was his choice to cry. And in these old Harveys videos, you get a sense of that. You see a young Gordon under Marco rolling out pasta. There's no effing and bollocking from him when he's rolling out sheets for the boss. Nope, he's full of respect. Yes, chef, no chef, very quiet. And when Marco stops and sarcastically asks if the pasta's really ready, Gordon is immediately put in his place. The point was perfection. So have a listen to this. It's Marco talking to the BBC's Desert Island Discs at around about this time about a typical Saturday night at Harveys.
Is there a lot of noise in this kitchen on a Saturday night?
Not from speech.
Just the clatter?
The only person who speaks is myself. No one else is allowed to speak. They just do their job. People don't understand 15 seconds is a lifetime in cooking. If you're cooking a very thin piece of salmon, in a pan and you're cooking it pink, if you leave it in there 15 seconds too long, then it's overdone.
Is there panic then?
No, I don't allow them to panic. If you panic, you've lost it.
But do you panic?
Never. I can't afford to.
But you're absorbing the stress.
I absorb the pressure.
Okay, sounds absolutely amazing. And it was something that one other person I talked to actually experienced. Michelin star chef Aaron Patterson, who himself did stints at Harveys and who I asked what it was like getting the apron on for one of those nights.
Very nervous, all depending on what sort of mood Marco is in. But it was very tight, very intense, and you've got to make sure you're on your mettle, that was for sure. But at the same time, very inspirational, very creative, and it was a pleasure to work with.
Well, it depends who else you ask. There's a marvellous encounter in this series where the camera crew go down the road to the fish shop where Marco gets his catch.
He's talking to the fishmonger, and the fishmonger's saying in the interview that you don't know what kind of Marco you're going to get, and he's either going to be effing and jeffing and complaining about produce, or he's going to say, "Hello, darling, how are ya?" And you see this, like, he's harsh when he needs to be, but his humanness and his human interactions are maybe far softer, and maybe he just doesn't know how to put that across in any other way apart from just shouting at someone.
But the best bit about that little interaction you're talking about is that after the fishmonger has told him that, he quickly looks over his shoulder and goes, "He's not here, is he?" It's an amazing piece of television. You couldn't write it.
But possibly the best moment of this whole series is when he's chopping an onion and he won't answer the presenter's questions until he's done.
I don't know whether he's having a bad morning or whether he had a bad night. I don't know what was going on, but he gets really, really prissy with the production crew. This lovely lady called Kay Avila, a great food journalist and documentarian. But she says, do you always do this, Marco? Yes. Do you do this, Marco? No. And then he just explodes. He says, "Look, just get out of here. If you want to leave, the door's there.
Yeah.
You can go." He says, "Do whatever you want, but don't expect me to sell my heart." It's this incredibly pompous and precocious, and that other word begins with P, I can't remember. But how did you react to seeing that?
I felt as though he was being particularly petulant, but in the way that a child is when they're being told something that they don't want to hear. And I don't know what happened in the run-up to him sticking his little bottom lip out and being annoyed, but this whole, like, if you want me to cut myself, I will, if that's what you want. And it's like, you've never said that at any other point. I think he's in a position where he's used to everyone just going, "Yes, chef, you do what you want and I'll just say yes."
Kirsty, though, is right about this. There's so much of the boy in this sulky, tempestuous moment. And yet at the same time, his idealism is captured exactly in this heated exchange. That's why it's so good. He's saying to the camera crew, "You don't like what I'm doing? Get lost. Eat me. I have to concentrate. My work, my food, this is the only thing." That's what I think is really telling. But above all, it's fantastic TV. Really fantastic TV. You can learn so much from Marco in the little inserts as he cooks lamb on little butter wrappers that you usually throw out, salmon in nothing more than tomatoes blitzed in, more butter, all over this little stove in the light that's sort of lucozade orange in the heat haze of this kitchen, all set to the kind of jaunty violins that sort of echo the decor. But the funny thing about Harveys is that it was nearly doomed right at the beginning. The place had opened in the winter, and in early 1987, no one was coming, particularly to the wrong side of London. So all that talent, all that hard work, it looked like it was gonna flunk. But then one day, this food writer books a place, a guy writing for the Sunday Times, one of Britain's most respected newspapers. I've actually gone back into the archives to dig it out because though Marco's talked about it in the past, I've never actually read it. So I have it here, 8th of March 1987. This is where the legend begins. This food writer calls Marco, quote, "a gaunt 25-year-old fanatic with unruly locks." He goes on, "I was astonished that a humble small place run on a shoestring, beset with operational nightmares, its kitchen staff hardly out of their teens, should attain such a high degree of excellence. Examples of his unsparing self-imposed tasks: terrine of leek and langoustine, baked scallops with coriander, impeccable tarragon sauce," and he goes on and on. But get this, the reviewer says, quote, "Marco works inhumanly hard an 18-hour day until 3 a.m, sometimes sleeps on the banquettes, those are like soft sofas, and adores it all. His 4 cooks, including a girl, are between 19 and 24. One of his obsessions, cleanliness, always makes him late. When he leaves, the kitchen is like an operating theatre with a difference. It has the sweet smell of success. Goodness me. I mean, a review like that would make anything the cool place to be seen in. But there was one factor almost more important than any description, like this. Up until then, Marco, remember, was just Marco White. He didn't especially want his middle name out and about, especially not in Leeds where he might have got his head kicked in. But there is the photo at the top of this review, and underneath it says, Marco Pierre White, trained by some of the great chefs. The name was like mystery and magic dust to the great and the good of London, and they came in their droves to be fed by this talented young man. Ironically, despite Marco hiding that middle name all his life before now, this reviewer had called him it properly and had pretty much christened him, Marco's own words. And with this review, he became himself. He became Marco Pierre White. And that reviewer's name, that dude in the Sunday Times? Egon Ronay. The man whose guide Marco had read all those years ago, whose words had inspired him to seek out the Box Tree restaurant. Talk about the stars aligning. Except it's kind of seeming to me at this point that it was like actually Marco who had aligned them. Harveys would get its first Michelin star in 1988. But speaking of legends, there would be one last trial in store for what I consider to be early period Marco. The deal with this first show recorded at Harveys was that, as well as letting the cameras into his kitchen to see the magic happen, Marco also had to cook a meal for each of his old bosses. He'd been through their kitchens, taken all they could throw, learned from them. Now it had come full circle. Albert Roux, who taught him not to fear the stove. Pierre the Bear Koffmann, silence in the kitchen. Nico Ladenis, don't put salt on his plate. And the balletic, intense Raymond Blanc. Getting that Michelin star might have been one thing, but cooking for all 4 of his former bosses, that's another. So they're each sat at his restaurant ready to survey his food. Their apprentice has become the young master. Well, what's really interesting here for a start is that there's no temper tantrum, no petulance here. The absolute opposite. These are father figures. Marco is in full deferential mood. Yes, chef, no chef, to his former mentors at the table. I mean, there's ego, sure, there's hubris as he waxes lyrical to them. But it's the kind that's still only trying to win respect. It's quite sweet, really. So who's my favourite? Well, my favourite is basically Nico Ladenis, the big, burly, bearded, mafia-looking guy, culinary genius. All Marco's hauteur disappears as he waits on Nico's verdict about the meal he's cooked him. It's a meal of sea bass, stuffed with a mousse of scallops on a deep red ratatouille. Nico looks at it. Goodness gracious, he says. It's like watching Marlon Brando consider whether pardoning or killing somebody. But in this old show, Marco is excitedly telling Nico about how the mousse is almost undetectable within the fish. How the pasta, because it's been fried and not boiled, actually has 2 different textures, like in a French fry. Marco's cheeks look hollow. His eyes look a bit sunken and his hair is greasy. He's obsessed over these techniques. And if you look closely at him, he looks at his most sweet and most polite. Nico takes a mouthful and he responds simply, And finally, Nico approves. And so too do the others, including his last mentor, Raymond Blanc, who is slightly more measured with his praise, but certainly not his pride. You can see it's a fantastic feeling in young Marco's face as well. He might have left school with no grades, but in this footage, he is very much their star pupil. I wonder, because I'm coming to all this a bit late in the party, but having read his autobiography now and all that, reading between the lines a bit, it's like these father figures are finally giving him their okay, which is what he wants, or at least what he needs from the tough masculine world that he's come from. Thing is, though, each of them also say the same thing, and it's nothing to do with the food. After they've enjoyed their meal, they all say something along the lines of, Marco, you came into my kitchen like a wrecking ball. You were different, sure, but you've got to watch it. You're going to burn out. You need to leave space, otherwise you're going to crash. And he sort of smiles and he looks down sheepishly. So, do you think he's going to listen to the oldies? Yeah, eat me. In the next episode, towering achievement, total burnout, hubris, the mass market. But enough about me. What about Marco? Well, he's on fire. We're going inside the book that changed everything. White Heat. The gritty pictures that made Marco the original rockstar chef.
That's not for in the kitchen. You're not putting that on the stand and making recipes off it. This is on your coffee table. Look at the photos. It's about him in this like punk rock. Look at him.
We're bent over the stoves in the hottest place you'd ever want to find yourself, Hell's Kitchen.
There's like a physicality of like a great big bear, but it's really weird because you could have your back to him and be at your station, but you were just aware that he was looking at you.
And also, I deep dive into the wisdom of those little stock cube videos he's done. They're very quick, they're very simple. There's no recipe, it's your choice. All that kind of stuff. Oh, one thing before we go. The fish pie. I told you there was fish pie wisdom to be had. Come with me into my tiny little kitchen. No, I started all this because I wanted to know how to make a nice fish pie. And when I clicked this video, it had the answer. There was something I didn't know I was missing. Something called a roux. R-O-U-X. This is something the most elementary cook could teach you, or for even greater accuracy, probably your grandmother. But I watched what Marco did. So, equal parts butter and flour. Let me just melt that in. And we stir it together and we incorporate our butter and flour. And this was the bit I started to get a bit suspect because it kind of looks like baby sick. But stick with it. In a second, we add our fish stock, which now definitely looks like baby sick. But here's the key. It's something that Marco insists on and that he'll repeat again and again and again in his videos. Work your roux, he says, in that incredibly serious voice. He will say this about sauces, mince, risottos, anything. He says, work it all the time. Work it. Now, I wondered what this was about. And what I think he means, well, look, at first I thought he just meant stir the shit out of it, but actually what I think he means is to incorporate the elements thoroughly and evenly to make sure everything moves across the surface of the bottom of the pan, stuff's well distributed, and that importantly it doesn't catch. But there are two things here. First, I have to turn the heat down, and secondly, really working it is actually very hard. You have to stay with the food, and kind of all we want to do is like move on to the next thing, but you gotta stay with it. And the second other difficult thing about working it, working the mix in your pan, is that it's hard on your arms, hard particularly over heat. Your instinct is to just walk away and accept less. The thing is, you shouldn't, because if you stick with it and if you work it, what emerges here is a velvety white sauce, something I never knew before, and that is the start of the creamy, gooey stuff that tastes like the sea. As Marco might say, it's that simple. But as usual, simple is not the same as easy. They're two different things, and in fact, working it is pretty bloody hard. Loads more wisdom from the big guy in episode 2. I'm Ciaran Tracey, and this is Eat Me from Big City Nights. Leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.